Okay, good morning, Annie.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever it is you happen to see this. Today is Friday, July 31st. This is
birthday, I have to say, Ibaye and Zichrono Livracha, Walter Joachim Grenn.
Amen.
Sorry. For that.
And this is Priestessing the Priestesses. I'm Kohenet Matan, and this is Kohenet Grenn. And this is our 8th episode of Priestessing the Priestesses. And today we're going to share our feelings about Tisha B'Av, the holiday that was yesterday, and the energies of this time of year. And is it okay if I drop that?
Of course, because we have to tell what the holiday is.
Yeah, right. Okay, so Tisha B'Av is the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, and it is an anniversary of destruction and calamity and loss in the Hebrew calendar. I often refer to it as a portal of grief. In particular, destructions that are said to have happened on that date are the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem and the destruction of the second temple in Jerusalem. And I believe the Munich Olympics massacre was said to have happened on Tisha B'Av as well. And maybe, Deborah, I don't know if you know other things that have said to have been. I feel like that's enough, but it's been historically it feels like this is the time of year that holds this space for mourning and grief, and especially the 3 weeks and then the 9 days leading up to it. There are a lot of customs about embodying mourning and grief. So I'm happy that it's over. And the next thing, so we're about to go into Shabbat, and this Shabbat is the Shabbat of comfort, Shabbat Nachamu, that brings us out of grief into comfort. And then next week, there's a holiday, Tu B'Av, which is the 16th day of the month of Av, which is a love holiday. So we're going from permission to feel grief into comfort, and then rising up into love. And that's where I think that's a pretty good description of where we are. But was there anything you'd like to add, Deborah?
I was saying, as we started talking about this, I was saying to Annie that I didn't go to any of the services around this holiday because I don't really resonate with observing. I acknowledge it, of course, but I don't really observe in any way or go into deep grief around the destruction of the ancient temple. It just seems too far removed, even though my research for more than 20 years has been about the temple, but in terms of the relationship of priestesses, which Annie will talk about, and the rituals, certain rituals and rites. And so, yeah, I mean, there's so much to grieve about right now. And
yeah, you were saying that the opportunity to grieve what's happening right now is more resonant for you.
Right, and even although I don't work with it on any regular basis, Lamentations. It is certainly a time to look at that and to acknowledge our own deep, multi-layered, manifold grief on so many levels right now. But Annie, you had a very unusual response to the holiday and to when I said I find it hard to resonate with it. You said.
I said, I'm grieving the loss of the priestesshood and sort of celebrating the destruction of the temple that led to the destruction of the priestesshood. So for me, I feel like the holiday is complicated, being Jewish and being a priestess. And I would say, add to that, since you mentioned Lamentations, for me, I mean, the book of Lamentations is a visceral description of the destruction of the feminine. And so, when we get into that text, then we can really find that place for grief. And I think talking about what's happening in modern times, the interestingly misappropriated but maybe still useful campaign on Instagram this week, the Challenge Accepted campaign, where women have been posting black and white selfies, and without knowing what the origin was. And it turns out the origin of this campaign was to raise awareness about femicide in Turkey, and that in Turkey, folks are waking up every morning to another black and white photo of a woman who was murdered. And and so it's been really interesting to see first I think there were over 4 million posts with this hashtag challenge accepted. So 4 million faces of women took flooded Instagram. And the seed of it was a response to the murder of women. And now that the word is getting out about what the seed was, people are educating each other. So there was a moment of frustration on the part of those who started the campaign because it got taken into this women empowerment, tag your friends thing. But I feel like this year I'm really feeling a flip in the energy around Tisha B'Av, like the way that I'm resonating, like bring back, it's not quite right, the mourning around gender-based violence, acknowledgement, so I can access my own trauma and the trauma of women and marginalized genders, and how the destruction, in the course of the destruction of the temple, there was immense gender-based violence, both to humans and the exile of the divine feminine.
And to animals, because
during
the temple there was a sacrifice, particularly at the pilgrimage festivals. What I'm also thinking when you're raising all this is that also in that period, I think probably between First and Second Temple, but I may be off on that. It may have been around or just before First Temple. But in the Book of Kings, for example, we see real destruction symbolically of the sacred feminine as embodied by Asherah. Both the Asherah pole that represented her and other representations, which also included little things, little shrines. We're not sure what they are. There's no real description, but there have been some imaginings, that these are maybe little woven houses that were in the temple for, I think, over 260 years. 264, I think it is, years, that a symbol of Asherah was in the temple. And that then when King Josiah decided this was no longer tenable, he not only had them removed, but with such vitriol that there's a description of how they were taken out of the temple and crushed, destroyed, ground into dust, and in the worst of these descriptions, taken up to the hills, which were the high places where the sacred altars and the priestesses and the prophetesses held court, so to speak, and led the people, and people came to hear them and see them, went up there and would disperse the grounds that they had onto tombs, onto burial grounds.
Right. Destruction layered on destruction.
Right.
Yeah. And intentional desecration of the sacred feminine.
Absolutely.
And I want to, if we're talking about modern time, I want to say also today, so I in that time, so the pole or the tree, the place of worship of Asherah, the sacred tree of Asherah, was in the courtyard of the temple. This is my understanding, and I read this in the prophets were complaining about the women. They're worshiping the Asherah in the courtyard again, right? This is before it was torn down, and how interesting that even today, thousands of years later, we are still facing argument, and there's still patriarchal roots in Judaism that are debating women's place in worshiping in the courtyard of the temple. And this is what Women of the Wall is about, right? So in some ways, we haven't come far enough. We haven't come very far, and there's plenty to continue mourning. The spaces that women can and cannot access, the sacred spaces that women can and cannot access in regards to the temple are still contested.
Right, and the wall itself, of course, is thought to be a wall of the temple. And it just occurred to me, for the historians out there, I should correct myself. If King Josiah was having her thrown out of the temple, then of course we're in the First Temple period. But yes, Women of the Wall, I wonder what they did. It'd be interesting to look at their website and see what they did around this holiday, because absolutely their voices are being, they are attempting to silence their voices, but for 30 years? Under the leadership of Anat Hoffman, and now I think it's Yohi Rappaport, they are doing amazing amazing demonstrations. They are sneaking Torahs into the area, the women's area of the wall, so that they can do B'nai Mitzvot for young girls. They are wearing their prayer shawls, their talitot, and they
also, yeah.
right, and they are singing, they are chanting, all of which are forbidden, so to speak, or certainly resented by Orthodox women, unfortunately, some of the radical women, and of course the men who have had these women arrested, had thrown chairs at them and other unspeakable things, and even torn up their siddur, tore up their prayer book at the wall, at the separation between the men's and women's sections, because of their fear of women's voices, because they might be too sexual, and God forbid they might get aroused because they can't.
When I was there in 2012, we were praying on Rosh Chodesh, on the new moon, in the women's section, and the men were they were blowing a shofarot, to drown out our prayers.
Unbelievable.
That our prayers should not be received by God because they were a desecration. So I feel like it's important to draw the connection. You know, when we mourn the destruction of the temple, what are we mourning? And I appreciate that you brought up the animal sacrifice, you know, and you mentioned before we hit record, the transition, the destruction of the temple also represented the transition from sacrifice to prayer. Maybe you want to say something about that.
Well, I would just think that it is also something to celebrate, that instead of having to sacrifice life for various ritual and other reasons, we were able to then create prayer. I find that such a powerful medium and vehicle for transmission in both directions. And it's developed in many ways, and I was just writing about this yesterday, you know, the amount of new liturgy, feminist liturgy that's been written, and the adaptations since Marcia Falk's Book of Blessings and other works that has been done on what can be very rote patriarchal language is very exciting, and that continues every day. And I think that gives women who will take it the opportunity to empower themselves, and I'm very much in this article encouraging that women take agency in that way. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. This, by the way, I just want to announce, because it's such a good interdisciplinary journal online for many years under the leadership of Batya Weinbaum. That's what I'm working on this article for. So that'll be out sometime in a few months, I think. But anyway.
And just in case there's a little bit of a blip in on my side, can you just say the name of the leader, of the person, and the name of the publication again?
Sure. FemSpec, FEMSPEC, all caps, online journal, and it's Batya Weinbaum.
Thank you. That was clear.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. And I also want to say I'm feeling, I think I mentioned, and I'm really feeling a shift this year, maybe because I didn't go to a communal thing, and also because the communal things aren't really available to us right now because we can't gather, but where, you know, some of the customs, and I'll say, I'm going to make a little plug. I did an IGTV, an Instagram TV video on Wednesday, a channeled message for Tisha B'Av. It's available on my Instagram @Matan, and also on my Facebook. And I really encourage you to check it out, because I talk a lot more about the energy of this time. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is I feel this shift, like there's really an emphasis on sitting in the discomfort, which is beautiful permission for feeling grief, which I think we need space and time for that in our society, and especially right now when there's so much grief and so much fear. And also the way that we, like the customs through which we access that discomfort and that mourning separate us from other people. Even though we go when we can gather, we gather and listen to lamentations together. We are told, we do it in mourning mode, which is when we don't make eye contact, we don't greet each other. We're in a room with other people, but we're completely ensconced in our own personal experience. And for some people, I think that does work. It gives them permission to bring their private feelings, embody their private feelings in their own space without worrying that anyone is watching or judging them. And for me personally, in order to fully embody and feel my grief, I need connection. And it's like when I know, I said this in the Instagram somewhere in my stories recently, but I know when I need to cry, sometimes the tears don't come until someone takes my hand or puts a hand on my shoulder. And we missed that this year. Like we didn't have to sit in a room and not make eye contact, or at least I didn't. So I've just been leaning into how, and this is the Shabbat of comfort, Shabbat Nachamu, how the offering of comfort can meet us in the place of grief and transform it. Not to skip over grief,
right,
but to say, what if I meet my grief with softness, with compassion, even with pleasure, which is a real rewiring of the nervous system, right? Instead of with deprivation and hunger and discomfort, which is the traditional custom, right? That fasting, no sex, no bathing, no anointing, no drinking. Those are the 5, same as Yom Kippur. Right?
Hair cutting.
Oh, and, right, and no hair cutting. Yeah. So, there's a real sense of like being present in the discomfort in our bodies, in the traditional customs. And I've been since 2014 actually in a workshop at Kohenet. And I know Sarah Chandler, Kohenet Sarah Chandler was in that workshop as well, and I can't remember who else was in my group. But we've been talking about what if we meet this time of year with radical compassion, comfort, creativity, collaboration. Then what happens when we arrive at the portal of grief? Maybe we transform it. And I'm feeling that this year, that we're seeing the rise of the feminine at levels that I don't think we've seen in my lifetime.
I think that's true. Yeah, and it's partly possible because we can communicate in these new ways, that we can expand our spiritual communities. I can be with my community in Colorado and up north in California because I don't have to travel there. And
yeah, look at that. You're in California and I'm in Toronto.
Right. We're a perfect example. Yes, I think that is happening, just as the voices of protest and refusal to any longer be invisible and marginalized are rising. And I think the challenge in front of us is to be prepared for the kind of resistance to that we've seen in Portland, and which could only
Yes. And I want to say, for me, in my discomfort with the temple and my association of the temple with the patriarchal system, for me, it feels like what we're watching happening in our society right now, we're watching the modern day white supremacist capitalist patriarchal systems that are like, for me, that are like the modern day temple. We're watching it fall. And what's happening is, and this I get from Lori Ladd, who I was listening to the other day, she's saying they're resisting, like the system is resisting its demise by grasping for more power and spreading more fear. And that's where we're seeing an uptick in the really frightening governmental behavior. And I think we're going to continue to see that throughout this year. I mean, according to the astrologers and the energy workers, we're going to continue to see that throughout this year as it all gets shaken down. And the uprisings in the streets are our response. It's like, let the destruction happen over there while we rise over here.
Right. And hold hope. I think that's an important piece. It has to be based on something, but I think action is one of the ways we find it. I just want to mention a source that came to me as you were talking, and that is, as you were suggesting, what if we meet it and even look at it as pleasurable, the fear and the resistance. Sultram Alioni has done a book a few years ago called Feed Your Demons, which talks about speaking to an illness, for example. And we have a big illness in this country, and we know where it's coming from. Speaking to that directly, as we might do if we're grieving a death, speaking to the departed directly. And so even giving it a face and a body of an animal, a person, in the case of an illness. And so it's just a book I would recommend, Feed Your Demons. So we have a few more minutes. I just have to say that because, I have to go in a few minutes, but I'm loving this conversation. I love the reframing you're doing of, some celebration of the temple as something which squashed perhaps the sacred feminine, and certainly did not recognize the leadership of priestesses, which I think was happening outside the temple walls. And one strong point that I felt for over 20 years has been that an ancient Hebrew or Jewish priestess were also independent women who people came to, who people trusted to do a blessing for them or remove a curse or, create an amulet and so on, and do a funerary rite, a birth blessing. And I don't think it was just, as is the common belief, I don't think it was just daughters or wives of priests.
No.
Of Kohenet.
No.
But there is nothing about that. There's no material evidence to go on, and we've had to use our imaginations and our cellular memory. I think we've had to draw on. There have been tiny little clues and bits of evidence, which is what got me started on the whole term Kohenet in 98 or 7. And that was, I just also have to mention this book by Bernadette Bruton, Women Leaders in the Ancient Synagogue. And that talks about both priests and patrons, but also priestess and places where she did find material evidence in the ground, which I wish we had more of. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and maybe there is more. I mean, I wonder, because I know I learned in Kohenet that there are gravestones in places in Europe that have the word Kohenet on them, and and the rabbis of the time said, no, that's the wife of the Kohen, or that's the daughter of the Kohen. Like, they just erased the possibility that there could be women in these positions of leadership.
They still do that. I was pursuing something Bruton mentioned in Bet She'arim, and it was in the catacombs. Exactly. There was a symbol, and there was something that said Kohenet. But when I saw that in a giant, one of 3 giant volumes, from the archaeologists who dug and explored in Bet She'arim, which is outside Haifa, maybe 30, 40 years ago. And it said, Kohenet = priestess. I was sure that that's what we were talking about, independent women. And I ran that past the librarian and my dear cousin, who at that point was about 82, and they immediately said no. Immediately denied the possibility. It just wasn't even on the horizon. So, but the intuitive hit I had in my body was one of my first, and it was really like a bolt of lightning that ran through me, and that became my work.
Right. So the question is, I think there's plenty more evidence out there, and it's been denied.
Yes.
Because the patriarchal system is invested in maintaining the illusion that women don't do this.
Right.
And here we are.
Yeah.
Pardon?
I think that's part of our mourning as well. The ways that our names have been erased and our practices have either never been discussed or been erased and silenced. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I'm reclaiming Tisha B'Av for, is an opportunity to mourn the ways that priestesshood has been erased, and I think when we show up resourced on that day, our grief comes also with our power. And we rise and meet this. Maybe we can transform this portal of grief. The rabbis say that on Tisha B'Av, that's also the day the Messiah is born. And I like to say, the Hebrew word for Messiah is Mashiach, and I like to say Mashicha, the feminine. Maybe, and for me, it's the Messianic age is the age we're in. We are the embodiment of the divine, and the work that we are doing is the work of Goddess in the world.
And definitely Shekhinah's return from supposed exile is that would paint her as Messiah in a way, right? And the idea that she will only return when the world is whole, or traditional texts say when the Messiah comes. But yes, if she's it, she's waiting. Rita Gross said she will return when there's male and female balance, when in other words, when there's peace in the world and when we're balanced. And we are working hard on making that happen, to be sure.
Right, we'll feel it. And what does it mean that Shekhinah returns? She's here.
Right, maybe
she's just invisible because there are too many who are still making her invisible. So we'll be able to see her clearly, and we are allowed in the society to embody her clearly.
Right, and probably she never left. I should correct myself.
Yes, I think she never
Not
left.
maybe. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I feel like that's more than probably.
Yeah.
But she was written out of the mainstream narrative of the time, right? Like she was not allowed. We were not allowed to talk about her publicly, but she was always there. She just went underground. And so those of us who were practicing, I mean, I say us, like I feel like I was there, you know, just the way we talk about Exodus,
Right.
as if we were there. I feel like I was there, and I feel like the practices of the priestesses went underground, and we see evidence of that in the text too, in the book of Samuel, where Saul, you know, after banning women doing these practices, he went and found one.
Right, he found the witch of Endor, and also that's a piece about ancestor reverence and what our practices were back then.
Yes, and our mediumship, right? So there's so much here.
There is.
I know you've got to go.
Right, there's a lot to excavate, and I want to say that a lot of it's in the Talmud, where Shekhinah is really first referred to. But yeah, let's talk at a future time about the cloud that came down from the mountain, about the presence, which is her, in the tent of meeting, in the Mishkan, in the desert. Let's talk about not deneutering and not degendering those moments. Yeah, which I think is what.
Yeah, and at some point we'll talk about gender in this context too. And I think, you know, I want to name that the binary is also problematic, and that we're in an amazing age now where we're learning how to see beyond the binary. Yeah. So we've got lots of bookmarks for future conversations.
And we have a guest speaker coming up in the next week or two, and we'll let you know the date in some way. I guess we'll post that, on our pages.
I mean, we'll just show up and she'll be here.
We'll just show up. Like magic.
Yeah.
All right.
We wish you a Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Nachamu Shalom. May you feel comfort this Shabbat and arising into love and power.
And if you don't observe Shabbat, may you find comfort and peace and hope in your homes and in your hearts and with your beloveds.
Amen.
Amen.
Take care.
You too.